What is up, guys? Today we're going to be comparing the iPhone SE 2020 to the LG G7. Now, this has been regarded as really the, I guess, value king for a lot of people, the SE, and I can see why it is a really great phone since the short time I've been playing with it, but this is my value king, the G7. It is the phone that I recommend the most for people that's looking for something that's very cheap, and this phone is extremely cheap right now. You can find it for around 200 bucks. I'll put the links down below. This is for around 400 bucks right now. We'll also put that down below, and we can see how these two phones stack up, and you'll see the difference on why I love the G7 so much as sort of like a value flagship. Now, taking a look at the hardware, I think the G7 actually aged better than this old iPhone design that they went with, even though this is a phone that came out in 2020. As you can see, I think the more cameras on the back have a lot to do with it as well. Just like if I took out the A51, just more cameras just makes it look newer. But again, these are two very nice phones, glass and metal designs on both of these phones, which is very nice. I think they feel about the same weight. As you can see, the SE 2020 is definitely a little bit smaller than the G7. Power button on both of these guys. On the right hand side, you have your Google Assistant button, volume rockers, your mute switch on the iPhone, and of course you have no headphone jack on the SE. You have your headphone jack on the G7, and you also have stereo speakers on the SE, and you have a really good boombox speaker on the G7. Both of these phones have IP ratings, so you can get them wet no problem. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the display. So you have a 720p plus display on the iPhone SE 2020. It is an IPS panel. You also have an IPS panel, but the big difference is it's 1440p instead of 720p, and you have a way higher pixel density. If I go ahead and bring up the specs on both, as you can see, we have 564 for the PPI, and on the iPhone you have 326. So basically, when you're looking at icons on the G7, they just look really crystal clear. It looks like somebody painted it on. It's really a beautiful display. Now, you do have sort of, an older looking design on the SE 2020. It's got a lot of flack for that, just having these huge bezels, and as you can see with your Touch ID down here, fingerprint scanner is on the back on the G7, and you have the notch on the G7. So again, I think the G7's design definitely aged much better than the SE 2020's old sort of iPhone 8, 7 design. Now again, going back to the display, you are going to notice a difference. If you're watching videos in 1440p or even 1080p, you are going to notice the difference in terms of quality on the G7. It's just going to be much better than the iPhone. Now, they both get pretty bright, so I have to say that for both phones, I don't have an issue with outdoor use on both of these phones. But yeah, as far as media consumption, the G7 is just miles ahead of the iPhone SE here. It's just a beautiful experience on here. And like I said, these big bezels are, has not aged really that well. Alright, so let's go ahead and hear the speakers side by side. Again, the boombox speaker on the G7 versus the stereo speakers on the iPhone. So the iPhone does have really good bass presence, but the G7 is overall the louder and just more crystal clear sounding speaker here. And you do get a little bit of distortion on the SE at max volume. You don't really get that on the G7, but both speakers are actually really good. So let's go ahead and talk about software real quick. So you have actually Android 10 on the G7, and you have iOS 13 now. Of course, the SE is going to have a super long life when it comes to software updates. So if you're choosing between these phones, you will be getting updates on this phone for years to come. This phone, the G7, might get Android 11, but I wouldn't count on it. I do think this might be the last update for the G7 because you got to remember it got Android 8, 9, and now 10, so it might not get Android 11 here, but you know, again, fingers crossed. But as far as the software experience, you have the Snapdragon 845 with 4 gigs of RAM on the G7, expandable storage as well, and you also have 64 gigs of internal storage on the G7. And on the iPhone, you have the Apple A13 chip. You have no expandable storage. You also have 64 gigs of internal storage as well. Now let's go ahead and try a little mini speed test. We know the A13 is going to do just really great, but let's go ahead and see Instagram. Again, not bad. I think the SE got it there, but again, very close to each other. Let's go ahead and try YouTube. Again, SE. Again, G7 not far off. Now, a game would be where you should see a big difference. Already in on the SE. Again, not terrible on the G7, still fairly fast. Again, with that Android 10 update, it did make a big difference. Let's go ahead. What are the NBA standings?
Here are the standings for the NBA from the current season.
As you can see, just very fast on the SE, but again, it's not like crazy faster than the G7 here. Now, what a lot of people don't know is the G7 is still really good for gaming. So if I go and look at the settings, you can see we're on HDR Ultra on the frame rate. It's going to be about the same as on the iPhone for PUBG, as you can see HDR, but we have extreme frame rates on the iPhone. So again, this is going to be still a great gaming device, and again with the 1440p display, everything just looks crystal clear. It's just really nice to look at. But both of these phones, you will be able to game perfectly fine at high settings. These will play all of the latest games, Call of Duty, Fortnite, whatever. You will be able to do that on these phones, and they both perform really well. So no issues with gaming at all on these guys. Now let's go ahead and talk about the camera. So as you can see, the specs right here: 16 megapixel standard, 16 megapixel ultra wide on the G7, 4K 3060 FPS. You have 8 megapixel selfie camera. On the iPhone, you only have just one camera. It's a 12 megapixel still, and you also have a 7 megapixel front facing camera as well. So I would definitely go with the SE still. I think it just has the better camera, even though you can get Gcam installed on the G7, and it definitely makes a huge difference. I still do like the pictures, how they come out on the SE compared to the G7, especially with the front facing camera. So overall, I just found photos to be just slightly a little bit more detailed on the SE, especially in certain lower light conditions. Even though both of these phones don't really have a dedicated night mode, I just found the overall photos, dynamic range, everything to be a little bit better on the SE 2020. That's what really makes this phone kind of special. Now, both of these phones have NFC for mobile payments, which is really great. So if you're into that, they are both here. So let's go ahead and talk about the battery life. So battery life on here on both of these phones is actually pretty decent. As you can see, go ahead and show you guys these specs. So on the iPhone, you have a 1821 milliamp battery with wireless charging. On the G7, you have a 3000 milliamp battery with 18 watt fast charging and wireless charging as well. So basically, you're getting around the same battery life on both of these phones, around 6 to 7 hours of screen on time, depending on how hard or light you use them. But that's usually what I get on both of these phones. So you can definitely get through the day no problem on both of these phones. So overall, I think the huge advantages of the G7 is just the display is just so much better on here. Also, the quad DAC is really great. The speaker on here, so if you're just really into audio, the G7 is just much more superior device here. But I think the cameras are just really excellent on the iPhone, and also video is super solid on here too. And this is an extremely fast phone, a very powerful phone with the A13 chip. So let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you guys in the next one.